They say monsters hide in the dark, but Roy Ellis didn't really bother hiding. His name is still heard through Nebraska's prison walls, a man whose calm smile now sits behind the words, "Death Row Inmate." But before the cameras, before the crime he committed, before the conviction, he was just another face in the crowd. A neighbor, a friend, someone you'd pass on the street without a second thought. But every small town has its secret, and this one was buried beneath fear, rage, and the very haunting silence of a little girl's disappearance. What happened next tore through families, faith, and the illusion of safety itself. Now, years later, as Ellis waits in a concrete cell for an ending he can't control, the question still lingers: what really led him there? In June 2022, a Nebraska court clerk filed another decision in a case that had been circulating through the legal system for 14 years. The ruling ran 73 pages and addressed arguments about DNA evidence, trial strategies, and whether lawyers had done enough to challenge the forensics that connected a man to a child's murder. At the end of all those pages, the same answer came back like all the answers before it: denied. The man at the center remained exactly where he'd been since 2008, sitting in a cell on death row while attorneys filed motions and judges wrote opinions that cited the same facts over and over in slightly different legal language. The case traced back to a Tuesday afternoon in November 2005, when something happened on a residential street in northeast Omaha that would take 6 months to even begin revealing itself. It was afternoon, and the routine at that time followed a pattern that had been established over months of school days. A 7th grader took the bus home from Beverage Magnet Center in Omaha, got off at the stop at Florence Boulevard and Pinckney Street in the northeast part of the city, and started the walk toward her family's house a few blocks away. She never arrived, and when her parents realized she was missing, they made calls, contacted police, and by the next morning the search had expanded to include volunteers, FBI involvement, and eventually the Polly Klaas Foundation, which specialized in finding missing children.
Just come home, Cindy, we need you.
The neighborhood where this happened wasn't really the kind of place where children vanished in daylight hours. Florence Boulevard runs through a residential area where people know their neighbors and watch out for each other. And the route from the bus stop to the girl's home covered familiar streets where she'd walked hundreds of times before. But somewhere between getting off that bus and reaching her front door, she disappeared without anyone seeing what happened, without witnesses reporting a struggle or hearing screams, without any trace of where she'd gone or who she'd gone with. Omaha responded the way communities do when a child goes missing. Lots of billboards went up across the city with her photo and a hotline number. Even Fox's America's Most Wanted featured the case twice. Search parties organized every weekend to comb through parks and vacant lots and wooded areas where a body might be hidden. The family did media interviews, made public pleas, and tried to keep the case visible while police worked through their investigation, which included looking at the family itself. The scrutiny added another layer of trauma to parents who were already living through the worst experience imaginable, waiting for any information about where their daughter had gone. For 6 long months, there was nothing concrete. Then, in February 2006, someone found a book bag. A man who used a cement mixer as a garbage container near 21st and Lake Streets discovered some jeans and a jacket inside that hadn't been there before. Items that would later be identified as belonging to the missing girl. Police Chief Thomas Warren told reporters it was key evidence, but wouldn't elaborate on what the bag contained or how it connected to the case. And it was about a block from a boarding house on Ohio Street where a man named Roy Ellis had been living before the girl disappeared. Ellis was already on law enforcement's radar. He was a registered sex offender classified as level 3, which meant authorities had determined he was at high risk to reoffend. His criminal record stretched back decades and included convictions for sexually assaulting children. In 1999, he'd been convicted of raping 2 girls. And by November 2005, he was living less than a mile from where the missing girl's family lived, in a neighborhood where she would have walked to and from her bus stop regularly. But he wasn't a public suspect yet because the book bag had been found, but the girl herself was still missing, And without a body, investigators couldn't confirm whether they were working a kidnapping or a murder. Then, in May of the same year, two men went into Hummel Park walking down a blocked-off road and into a wooded area off the main trails, when one of them spotted a skull at the base of a tree that made him start yelling. When police secured the scene, they found more bones scattered in the dirt, along with remnants of a red sweater and a cross necklace that was still threaded around vertebrae. When they tested the DNA, they confirmed what the family already knew. The little girl had already been dead for 6 months, hidden in a park that Ellis's ex-girlfriend would later testify he liked to use for intimidating women. The autopsy on the bones revealed blunt force trauma to the head from a single blow that had shattered the skull with enough force to kill. But there was no evidence of how the body had been transported to Hummel Park, or how long it had been there, or whether death had occurred at that location or somewhere else. 6 months of decomposition and exposure to weather had eliminated most of the forensic details that might have answered those questions. What remained was a skeleton with a crushed skull, some clothing, and that book bag that had turned up 3 months earlier near where Ellis lived. When forensic analysts tested the clothing from the book bag, they found the girl's blood on the jeans and jacket. They also found some DNA mixture on the left leg of the jeans, near the hem, that included both the victim's profile and another profile that matched. Roy Ellis. The location and pattern of the DNA deposit resembled what analysts would expect to see if someone had grabbed the fabric or handled it after getting blood on their hands. The mixture looked consistent with a handprint, though they couldn't say definitively that's what it was. Ellis had been in jail when the book bag was found in February 2006, which meant he couldn't have personally placed it in that trash bin. But he hadn't been in jail when the girl disappeared that day in 2005. Records showed he'd been arrested on November 3rd for violating a protection order and had been released the same day, which gave him 26 days of freedom before going back into custody on December 19th for another violation. During that window, the child had disappeared, and during that window, someone had put her book bag with his DNA on it somewhere. The thing is, while sitting in jail through late 2005 and early 2006, Ellis had conversations that would later get used against him when he asked a corrections officer how long bodies took to decompose after burial and became visibly upset when told it could take up to 2 years. But then he asked how long DNA in blood and semen stayed viable for forensic testing, just to show how chilling and dark the story of what could have happened could be. In recorded phone calls to his girlfriend, he said that something had happened in November without elaborating, and that he had been evil the last couple of months. Then, in a call to a friend, he had said that he needed to clean his trail.
Roy Ellis's own words seem to verify testimony that he had an unusual interest in the search for Amber Harris.
None of these statements can prove he killed anyone, but they painted a picture of someone who had done something and was trying to calculate how much investigators could prove.
Police reports, hundreds of photos, and excerpts from phone calls made from this jail comprise the evidence in the Roy Ellis murder trial. Prosecutors used all those elements in order to paint Ellis as a man quick to wanting to cover his tracks.
But that was not all, because there were also inmates who came forward after his arrest. Several men Ellis had been incarcerated with told police that he had admitted to killing the girl in conversations with them, and their accounts included specific details about blood on his car, about needing to cover his tracks, about sexual assault and hitting someone in the head. One even claimed Ellis had specifically mentioned using a hammer, while another testified that Ellis had talked about taking women to a wooded park for assaults and hitting them if they resisted, and that Ellis had cut out newspaper articles about the missing girl's case and showed unusual interest in how the investigation was progressing. Police executed search warrants and seized Ellis's car. A 1988 Mercedes-Benz, taking cloth gloves and soil samples from the wheel wells. And from the house he had stayed, they took a wood-handled hammer, a shovel with a broken handle, leather boots, and a 1990 Oldsmobile Cutlass that Ellis had borrowed in November and December 2005, cutting out pieces of the seat covers and headrests for testing. The investigation was building a circumstantial case, piece by piece, that prosecutors believed would add up to proof beyond reasonable doubt when presented together at trial. February 2007, 14 months after the girl's disappearance, police arrested Roy Ellis for first-degree murder. Then, Douglas County Attorney Don Klein announced he would seek the death penalty. Now, prosecutors would have to convince a jury that the man, in fact, had killed her, when the only physical evidence connecting them was DNA on her clothing and a collection of circumstances that suggested guilt without proving it outright. The girl's name was Amber Harris. She was 12 years old when she disappeared, a 7th grader who liked school and had a routine that hadn't varied much over the months leading up to November 29, 2005. Her parents, Michael and Melissa, along with siblings, lived in northeast Omaha, close enough to the bus stop that the walk home should have taken less than 10 minutes.
She was last seen on November 29th. This is video of the day she last stepped off her bus. When she walked off that bus, her feet landed in the same park her mother stands in now.
The neighborhood knew her. The way neighborhoods in that part of the city tend to know the children who live there. And when she vanished without explanation in broad daylight, it shook the community's sense that children were safe on their own streets. The 8 days between finding her remains in Hummel Park and getting DNA confirmation that the bones belonged to Amber were described by her mother as worse than the initial disappearance, because during the 6-month search there had been at least some irrational hope that she might still be alive. However, once they found the skull, that hope was gone. When detectives came to their home and told them what they already knew, Melissa Harris said later that she cried harder than she had when Amber first disappeared. So when the trial began in April 2008, no one in the courtroom could have fully prepared for what they were about to see. Over the course of the proceedings, the prosecutors played the recording of forensic teams digging through the soil of Hummel Park, and it silenced the room.
She's never out of my head, ever. Nighttime's the hardest for me still, especially this time of year, when it gets to be cold, and that's the worst time.
Slowly, they uncovered the remains of the little girl's bones scattered in the dirt. It was quiet at first, just the sound of shovels scraping through dirt, and then you started to see it. The bones, her red sweater half buried, and the cross necklace she always wore still looped around what was left of her spine. When the camera zoomed in on the hole in her skull, several jurors turned away, crying. Amber's cousin, Kara Money, said later that watching it literally tore her heart out. And really, who could blame her? It was one of those moments that pulled the air out of the room. When the prosecution leaned heavily on DNA found on Amber's jeans, they also went further and called Ellis's former stepdaughters to the stand. And what they said stunned the courtroom because they testified that their stepfather had sexually assaulted them repeatedly when they were just 12 and 14, around the same age Amber had been. Still, the case wasn't perfect because no one had seen the man with the little girl. There were no fingerprints, no witnesses, no confession. So, the prosecutors tried to weave together a story from bits and pieces, from DNA, timelines, his history, and hope the jury could see the picture. Meanwhile, Ellis's lawyers tried to prove otherwise by saying there was reasonable doubt and that a man's past doesn't prove murder. But the jury didn't see it that way because they came back after 6 hours with a guilty verdict. 3 days later, the sentencing phase wrapped up and his crime was additionally found to be brutal enough to warrant death. But after confirmation by a 3-judge panel, there was one problem. Nebraska had no way to actually execute him because the state's only method, the electric chair, had just been ruled unconstitutional. So Ellis's death sentence existed only on paper. Years passed, appeals dragged on for over a decade by then, with no end in sight to the legal proceedings and no execution date scheduled despite the death sentence that had been imposed 7 years earlier. However, the story didn't end with the verdict. In fact, that was only the beginning of a long, grinding legal process that would stretch over decades. 3 years after Roy Ellis was sentenced to death, the Nebraska Supreme Court took up his case again, this time to decide whether the trial judge had made a mistake by allowing Ellis's former stepdaughters to testify about being assaulted as children. In 2011, the court ruled that the testimony was fair because it showed a pattern of a man who preyed on girls Amber's age and that the value of that evidence outweighed any unfair prejudice. The justices also upheld the DNA evidence, agreeing that the experts had explained their testing properly. So Ellis's conviction and death sentence were affirmed, and the case moved into the next stage, post-conviction litigation, which is where death penalty cases usually take on a second life. But instead of debating what happened, lawyers start debating whether the trial itself was fair. This time, Ellis got new attorneys, and they went after his old defense team, claiming his trial lawyers hadn't done enough, especially with the DNA. They brought in their own experts, who argued that the statistics presented to the jury weren't as ironclad as the prosecution made them seem. But the state pushed back, saying that even if the DNA numbers were softer, the rest of the evidence, the jailhouse admissions, the history of sexual violence, the book bag near his home, his questions about decomposition, and all that would have led the jury to the same conclusion. Then, in 2019, the district court sided with the state. Maybe the DNA could have been cross-examined more aggressively, they said, but that wouldn't have changed the outcome. Ellis appealed again, and 3 years later, in 2022, the court now issued a 73-page opinion that rejected his every claim because they said Ellis had received a fair trial and would stay on death row. But final never really means final in capital cases. By 2024, his lawyers had filed a federal habeas corpus petition, basically another attempt to reopen the case. It listed 15 claims, including one questioning whether the death penalty still meets constitutional standards at all. But this time, the fight moved to federal court, where it is pending, awaiting briefing, responses, eventual oral arguments, and a decision that could take years to arrive. The process could even start over again with responses, hearings, rulings, and appeals, with each round could taking years. If he loses, they'll go to the 8th Circuit, and if that fails, the U.S. Supreme Court. It's a staircase of appeals that never seems to end. And even if every court upheld the sentence, there's still the problem of actual executions, because Nebraska still can't carry out executions. After the state Supreme Court struck down the electric chair in 2008, lawmakers had approved lethal injection. But in 2015, the state briefly abolished the death penalty altogether, which would have converted all death sentences to life without parole, only for voters to restore it with a referendum year later in 2016. However, since then, the state hasn't been able to get the drugs needed for lethal injection. Pharmaceutical companies refuse to sell them for executions, and importing them from abroad raises legal questions no one's been able to solve. So the result is a quite strange limbo. As of 2024, 11 people sit on Nebraska's death row, Ellis among them, but no execution dates are set. The state hasn't figured out its drug procurement issues, and even if it does, each execution would likely face last-minute legal challenges that could delay or prevent it from happening. He's been there since 2008, 16 years in a 6x8 cell, 23 hours a day. The case file has grown into thousands of pages, all circling the same core facts: a missing girl, a park, a red sweater, a man whose DNA was on her jeans. Still, the facts don't change, only the arguments do. Amber Harris would be 31 now. Instead, she's frozen at 12, her school photo appearing again and again in court records and old news clips. Her necklace, her jeans, her book bag, all cataloged and boxed away as evidence, waiting for the next motion, the next appeal, the next court to say what every court before has already said. The case that began in 2005 keeps moving, slowly and endlessly, and will likely continue for another decade or more before either Ellis dies of natural causes or Nebraska resolves its execution protocol, while Melissa Harris's words after sentencing still echoes that she won't have closure until the day she dies.
If I'm not on this earth anymore, if this does happen to him, if he outlives me, my daughters are adamant they'll be there.
If you want to see more chilling videos like this, like and subscribe, and stay tuned for more.